you'll see the mistake that they made because they believed in straight lines, because the church was promoting the idea of straight lines. They wanted to promote that cross. The God that they were talking about was not the true God of the universe. It was much larger than that.
Before this video begins, I want to warn you. In the following minutes, Terrence Howard explains some very important aspects that can radically change our future, highlighting the fact that we have all been living in a huge lie. These insights cover hidden aspects of the universe, our reality and religion, and they may disturb you. Therefore, please watch carefully and rewind if you feel you are not keeping up.
If you looked at this, you'll say, oh, that's a square right there. Right in the middle.
Sure.
You'll see that square happening right there. But if you look at it from the side, from its real perspective, you see that it's not. The straight lines are an illusion. Again, we are being fooled by our senses because there is no motion in a straight line.
Terrence challenges the idea of straight lines in nature, stating that everything in the universe is expressed in motion and all motion is expressed in waves, which are curved. He emphasizes that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, leading to greater curvature with increased action and resistance. This perspective suggests that the universe is based on balance, concept he believes Einstein neglected in his theory of relativity, particularly in relation to gravity. He argues that gravity is caused by electric forces. The electricity is always seeking a higher pressure condition, spinning northeast towards the center of an area like a cone. However, as new electric waves arrive, they push the existing waves outwards, creating vortices.
Electricity is always seeking a higher pressure condition. It spins northeast, is trying to get to the center of an area, the center of a cone. But the next electric wave is coming, so it gets pushed out, and as it's pushed out, it gets to the vortices. Now, instead of it spinning northeasternly, centripetally, it's forced to spin centrifugally, and it spins southwesternly.
These vortices force the waves to spin centrifugally, expanding and decaying until they form magnetic waves that intersect at 120-degree angles. At this point, these waves convert back into the electric field and return to their source, such as a star. Howard uses the analogy of human aging to explain this concept, noting that as we get older, we expand at the equator and shrink at the top. This is due to electric forces pushing inward and condensing, while magnetism expands outward at the equator. He describes electrons discharged as devitalized electricity from the sun and earth, which, upon hitting our magnetic field, get pulled back, compressed, and transformed into usable electricity for the earth, then pushed out again at the equator. This process explains why the earth's equator is wider than the poles by about 5 miles. He criticizes Einstein for coupling electricity and magnetism together without realizing that electricity is the equal and opposite of magnetism.
Einstein left that out of his equation because he coupled electricity and magnetism together and didn't realize that electricity was the equal and opposite of magnetism.
He compares breathing in, a contracted electrical process, to breathing out, a magnetic radiative process. He highlights that the term magnet is often misunderstood as an attractor, whereas to magnify something means to make it larger, which is the work of radiation. He credits Walter Russell for discussing these ideas extensively in the past. Terrence Howard explains that in the past, people believed the world was flat, a belief supported by the church.
If you look at Giordano Bruno's work, it looks a lot like my stuff. But he still had straight lines, and I think he put those straight lines in there to appease the church. They hung him upside down in 1600, the Catholic Church, and set him on fire because he refused to recant that the God that they were talking about was not the true God of the universe. It was much larger than that.
He mentions that the Pythagorean theorem, which relates to geometry, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, was promoted by the church, implying a preference for straight lines and geometric shapes. Terrence emphasized that this belief in straight lines extended to their understanding of the world and nature. He expresses astonishment that they didn't open the flower properly, a metaphor suggesting they failed to see the true complex nature of reality. The flower of life is one of the oldest symbols known to humanity, believed to be associated with the Anki, a figure from Sumerian mythology. He points out that assembling the pieces of the flower based on universal ratios reveals fundamental truths about the universe. In his book, which, by the way, is free and you can find it on tcotlc.com, a simulator is presented that explains the entire concept of opening the flower of life properly. For a better understanding, let me begin with Terrence's quote that explains his discovery. The fruit from the flower of life and the electric conjugated states that describe the filament, like configurations that occupy the Birkeland currents, which are the bonds that hold this and all worlds together, these are the negative spaces that dictate the shape of universal geometry and are completely responsible for all distribution of matter within our universe.
Instead of following the natural curvature of these 64 circles overlapping, they averaged the space where they met. And they invented straight lines.
This is called the Tetrahedron wave field, which describes the motion and pressure conditions where four equal and opposite bubbles, forces, or variables encounter each other in curved space. These areas where the surfaces of the bubbles do not touch are referred to as the in-between spaces or negative spaces. The fundamental principle is that the interactions in the universe depend on how many bubbles meet in a given space and under specific pressure and motion conditions. These conditions create the wave conjugation, which is the highest measurable pressure condition in the third dimension, making it the hottest place in the visible universe. Hydrogen, the first visible element considered incompressible, takes on this geometric form. As this geometry decays, it produces all other elements visible within the third dimension of measurable space and time. The decay and unwinding of this geometry are responsible for magnetism. Magnetism, when understood correctly, is the force responsible for the expanding effects in nature, generally known as radiation. Instead of just attracting, magnetism dissipates high potential into low potential by transforming high voltage pressure with low amperage into low voltage pressure with higher amperage. This transformation process is similar to how energy is released through radiation.
It has four contractive poles because electricity is seeking a higher pressure condition and forcing it in, where magnetism is seeking a lower pressure condition and spun out. So the vortices, those tips, that's the magnetic field, that's where they begin.
The process of magnetism causing energy to spread out corresponds to the effects of radiation. This process involves rarefying, evaporating, dissolving, and expanding, resulting in the formation of gases and vapors and creating a pressure gradient in space. These effects are the result of a repellent force that occupies the insulating position around solid masses, creating an environment with ever-lowering conductivity. The next one is the Huntian wave field, a concept that describes what happens when 8 bubbles come together, leaving empty spaces in between them. This situation is found at the center of all matter that is shrinking or contracting. It is closely related to the effect of electricity, specifically how matter that has broken apart comes back together. In simpler terms, think of matter as being squeezed from a larger size into a smaller size by an inward pulling force. This inward force is met with a resisting force that pushes outward. Imagine each of these bubbles like structures having a concave shape, similar to how nature works. In nature, there is a spiraling inward vortex that creates these concave shapes as it gathers electrically charged energy. This inward spiral pulls matter into a smaller space, resulting in the formation of what we perceive as solid objects. So the Huntian wave field helps explain how matter contracts and becomes solid due to the interplay of inward and outward forces driven by electrical energy. The Myra wave field explains what happens when 6 bubbles come together, highlighting the empty spaces in between that play a key role in creating the initial motion and pressure conditions of these waves. These wave interactions or conjugations are similar to what happens when 8 bubbles meet and are balanced by 2 tetrahedrons. In simpler terms, think of the Myra wave field as a way to describe how particles, which are actually wave interactions, behave when they come together. When these wave particles are in motion, their individual shapes and behaviors blend together and become part of the larger group due to fractal symmetry. Each point in this structure is the tip of a vortex, all interconnected and acting as one unit unless disturbed by another wave. At the center of the Myra wave field, you'll find the Huntian piece, which represents a state of light that contracts and forms a crystal-like structure.
And this looks just like a photon, and guess what? It has 30 poles. What is the speed of light? 299 million. They rounded off to 300 million kilometers per second squared. But if you look at it from the top, you'll see that I haven't violated anything. This looks like what happens in nature.
Even though this point is where 6 spheres meet, its behavior is controlled by a set of natural laws. This description shows how light and particles interact on a fundamental level, creating the complex structures we observe. The O'Brien wave field describes what happens when 12 bubbles come together. It focuses on the pressure and movement created by these bubbles in the empty spaces between them that aren't filled by the bubbles. These empty spaces, or negative spaces, exert force and pressure on the bubbles around them. In simpler terms, imagine 12 bubbles all touching each other. The spaces between these bubbles, which seem empty, actually push against the bubbles and affect their movement and pressure. This interaction of bubbles and empty spaces helps to explain how forces and motions work in this situation. Terrence explains that this is a structure that we often see in nature. However, this structure has 4 electrical poles that are not immediately accounted for. As you examine it, you can see these 4 poles, 1 at the bottom and 3 on the sides. This configuration is fundamental to the process of crystallization. The laws of crystallization are based on these kinds of stable structures where the arrangement of bubbles and the forces between them create a balanced, ordered form. These unaccounted electrical poles play a crucial role in how crystals form and maintain their shape. The interaction of these bubbles and the forces exerted by the empty spaces between them are what drive the formation of crystals in nature. The proof of Terrence Howard's work can be seen in platonic solids, which cannot combine all different platonic solids together in a way that maintains symmetry. These shapes, like cubes and dodecahedrons, have what's called discrete symmetry, meaning each shape is symmetrical on its own. You can combine some of these shapes, like cubes with cubes or dodecahedrons with dodecahedrons, but you can't combine all different platonic solids together in a way that maintains symmetry. However, when you look at wave conjugations, the interactions of waves described earlier, they can form supersymmetrical systems. This means that these wave interactions can align perfectly with each other, creating a system where everything fits together seamlessly. These wave conjugations represent a more comprehensive and unified system that the individual platonic solids can't. Howard gives an important warning about current specific models and practices. He mentions concepts like the boson, the God particle, the 3-quark model, the gluons, and the newer 4 and 5 quark models. These terms refer to particles and forces in physics that scientists study to understand the fundamental building blocks of the universe. Howard points out that scientists keep inventing more and more particles and models. He criticizes the use of the CERN collider, a massive machine that smashes particles together to study their properties. These particles, such as protons, are not just inert matter, but are actually live and conscious. His warning is that by smashing these particles together, scientists might be causing harm to conscious entities. He suggests that everything in the universe is conscious and that we should be careful with how we treat these fundamental particles. Terrence Howard explains that everything is conscious. He compares humans, animals, and plants to show that a grain of rice has 54,000 genomes, while humans have only 26,000, suggesting plants might be more evolved in some ways.
I have a picture showing hemoglobin and chlorophyll. And you're going to notice that the hemoglobin has the same exact combination of carbon and hydrogen that we have. The only difference they have is the center of theirs is magnesium and the center of ours is iron. That's the only difference.
Similarly, cephalopods, like octopuses, have copper in their blood instead of iron or magnesium. Despite these differences, the basic interaction is the same. Howard questions where consciousness occurs. Is it in the elements like iron, magnesium, or copper, which are influenced by pressure conditions? For example, cephalopods need copper because of their specific pressure conditions. He explains that changing the pressure or motion conditions changes the organism, but the principle of life remains the same. He emphasizes that there is no real difference between humans and plants. Just because we can't hear plants scream doesn't mean they aren't alive. Howard suggests that everything is alive and conscious, and we should respect all forms of life. The idea is that everything in the universe has consciousness, not just humans. Consciousness isn't limited to our brains or bodies. When comparing humans, animals, and plants, it's interesting to note that a grain of rice has more genetic material, genomes, than humans, which might suggest plants are quite advanced in their own way. In human blood, hemoglobin carries oxygen, and in plants, chlorophyll helps with photosynthesis. This shows that different organisms use different elements depending on their needs, but the basic function remains similar. The question of where consciousness exists is explored by looking at these elements. It suggests that consciousness could be related to these fundamental components and how they interact with conditions like pressure. This perspective encourages a broader understanding of life and consciousness, recognizing the interconnectedness of all living things. This questions traditional biblical views, asking if everything was created by a higher power and what that implies about the nature of life. We don't see plants and other non-moving things as alive because they don't communicate in ways we understand, and our senses are not attuned to perceive their consciousness. Using examples from the secret life of plants is shown that plants have behaviors indicating life and interaction. For instance, plants from the same parent grow moderately together, while those from different parents grow more aggressively. This suggests a form of cooperation and competition among plants. Additionally, experiments have shown that trees can transfer nutrients to their offspring. For example, a mother tree can pass radioactive carbon or nitrogen through its roots to its seedlings, demonstrating a form of communication and resource sharing. This indicates that plants are alive and sentient, contrary to the common perception influenced by biblical teachings, which often depict the universe as lifeless unless explicitly breathed into life by God. The conversation stresses that everything in the universe, including plants and seemingly inert objects, is alive and part of a larger divine system. When people do good things, it reflects well on this system, or God. And when bad things happen, it's often explained as mysterious workings of the same system. This perspective calls for recognizing the consciousness in all things and behaving responsibly, suggesting that doing the right thing leads to positive outcomes. Terrence explains that humanity is often heading in the wrong direction, largely because of scientific developments like the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887 and the rise of special relativity. These developments led to the idea that everything is essentially lifeless and random, implying that life has no inherent purpose. This perspective has made people feel less responsible for the world around them, treating life and the environment as if they don't matter, and justifying destructive behaviors. He criticizes this viewpoint, noting that it ignores the similarities between hemoglobin in blood and chlorophyll in plants. By applying the law of similarities, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. It's possible to see that these substances share fundamental traits. This leads to the broader insight that understanding one thing can help us understand many things, as everything is interconnected. The common factor in all of these things is hydrogen, which makes up 99% of the observable universe. By understanding the geometry of hydrogen, we can potentially manipulate a vast portion of the universe. This understanding opens up immense possibilities for what humanity can achieve. However, the current focus remains on making money rather than exploring these deeper connections and potentials.